everyone, this video is specifically going to cover the preparations you'll need to do in order to stitch my chain stitch variation sampler, which you can find in my Etsy shop. But if you are new to embroidery, the information we cover here will translate to any pattern or design you're doing. We'll be talking about how to choose fabric and frames, how to trace patterns, how to thread and knot needles, basically everything prior to making that first stitch. For my chain stitch sampler, or for pretty much any embroidery project, there are some basic supplies you'll need. You can find most of these items at a craft store or a fabric store, and you can also find a lot of them online. None of them are very expensive, so embroidery is definitely a great hobby to take up without breaking the bank. You will need fabric, and we'll talk about specific fabric types later. You'll need a hoop or a frame that you're going to place your fabric in while you sew it to keep it taut. You're going to need at least one needle. If you'd prefer to have multiple needles, we'll talk later about different kinds that are available. You'll need a pair of fabric scissors to cut out your fabric, and then you can also get these little scissors called snips to cut your thread while you're sewing. And you'll also need some sort of utensil to trace your pattern onto the fabric, and we'll also talk later about what kinds I prefer. You will need thread, preferably embroidery floss, but there are also some other options, and we'll talk about that as well. You will also need the pattern or design that you're planning to sew. And for this video, we are specifically talking about my chain stitch sampler, which is 7 different circles that you can sew separately, or you can put all together into sort of a flower motif. This pattern covers 90 different stitches that are all variations of a basic chain stitch, starting with pretty easy ones and moving up to the more difficult ones. By variations of chain stitch, I am using the definition of a loop of thread whose feet are together or apart, and whose top is secured to the fabric in some manner. So that includes stuff like fly stitch and feather stitch and lazy daisy and so many more. They all kind of fall under this coverage of chain stitch, and so I've combined them into this one giant sampler. You'll not only learn a ton from this sampler, I already learned a bunch just making it, but also it's going to look really pretty when it's done. So I always like to do something that is both educational and helps you expand your skills, and also create something worth framing and hanging up on the wall. One of the first decisions you need to make when starting an embroidery project is the size of your pattern. This is just important because you're going to have to print that pattern out, you're going to have to choose the size of frame you're using, and choose how big to cut out your fabric, so you need to know what size you're going to be making your design first. For this pattern, I like to use a 5-inch circle. Anything in the 4 to 5 to 6 range definitely works. If you're going less than 4 inches in diameter, you may find that the stitches are becoming too small and too crowded together, and you could do it, but I would suggest using 3 or fewer strands of embroidery floss, which would just be a little more difficult to complete. Anything bigger than 6 inches, you'll find that the stitches are becoming too large, too stretched, too far apart, and again, it could be done, but you'd want to be using a much larger thread or floss, such as a cotton pearl or even some yarn styles. I'll also note that if you don't have a printer at home, there are other options you can use to trace patterns, such as downloading the pattern directly onto an iPad or tablet, or in a pinch, tracing it directly off of a laptop screen, which I've done. It's not comfortable, but it does work if necessary. Printing is always going to be your best and easiest option for tracing a pattern, though. Once you've decided on a size for your pattern and you've printed it out or downloaded it onto a tablet, we next need to choose a fabric that you're going to be sewing on. My 3 favorites are cotton, linen, and canvas. These are all really great options for embroidery, and they each sort of have their own unique qualities that make them good. But before we talk about those, let's talk about a few fabrics that I highly would not suggest using, especially for a sampler like this. You want to avoid any kind of stretchy fabric. Something like knit is especially bad. And for this, I wouldn't suggest using a tulle or any kind of very loosely woven fabric either. Those can be really creative for some designs, but for a sampler, not the best. I also would highly recommend avoiding patterned fabrics, as it's just going to be really difficult to see through that fabric when you're tracing the design. and it can be a little distracting when you're doing something like a sampler. And then I would also avoid dark fabrics because these are harder to trace on as well. Granted, if you are accustomed to tracing onto dark patterns and you have the proper utensils for that, this sampler could look awesome on a black fabric or a navy blue fabric. But if you're just starting out and you're trying to choose the fabric that's going to be the easiest to use, you'll definitely be wanting to go with something that is non-stretch, not too loose of a weave, not too dark, and not heavily patterned. You don't need to spend a ton on fabric or even know a lot about fabric in order to embroider. I usually buy fat quarters or go through the sale bin at a fabric store in order to stock up my supply of fabric. The main key to remember is to avoid stretchy fabrics, especially for something like this sampler, and especially as a beginner stitcher. As you can see from this canvas, it doesn't stretch much when you pull it in either direction, and the same will be true of this cotton. It stretches just a little bit more in one direction, but not at all in the other one. And also the same can be said for linen. All three of these are also great colors that you'll be able to see through well with just the addition of light, so they are ideal for embroidery. Now that you've got your fabric, we're going to cut out a section of fabric big enough to sew our pattern onto. You'll want to use fabric scissors to cut out your fabric. Any form of paper scissors, typical scissors that you might have around the house. You can cut fabric with it. It's gonna be a giant pain in the butt though. Fabric scissors are specifically designed to go through fabric, and they are quite sharp and quite lovely, and you should not use them on anything other than fabric or you can ruin them. So a pair of fabric scissors is honestly might be the most expensive utensil that a beginner embroiderer should get, but it is well worth the investment. Keep in mind that you'll need the section of fabric you cut out to not only fit your pattern, but to also fit into the hoop or frame that you'll be using. For example, if I use this blue hoop, I can cut about the size of this piece of paper and it should fit in the hoop just fine. You generally want at least an inch of extra fabric hanging out of the hoop. But if I use this pink hoop, I would need to cut out a larger section of fabric just to make sure that that fabric is going to fit into my frame, even though the pattern size is not changing. So again, you'll want to make sure that you are cutting about an inch of extra space on either side. More than an inch is even more helpful. You're going to want something to hold on to when you're tightening that fabric into the frame. So if you're cutting too close to the size of your frame, you're not going to be able to pull your fabric as tight as you need to. So I'm going to be cutting out a piece of fabric about the size of this piece of paper because I'll be sewing each section of this sampler separately, and I'll be doing it in this blue frame right here. So a paper-sized piece of fabric should fit perfectly in my frame. It'll fit my pattern perfectly on it, and I probably won't end up framing these for display, so that part doesn't really matter. If you're going to be sewing the pattern as one big floral motif, you need to lay out your patterns ahead of time and make sure that the entire circle will fit on the fabric that you're going to cut out, all 7 circles together. Cut out a piece of fabric that will fit your entire pattern, and then you can frame each section and trace it and sew it, and then move on to the next section. So you don't necessarily need to have a giant frame just because you're sewing the pattern as one big piece. Next, let's talk about your frame options. While an embroidery hoop is the most common thing to sew in, there is an option of this pipe, square, or rectangular frame. I usually hear it called a Q-snap frame. It does have a few other names though. This is great if you want to sew the piece as one big floral motif. It can fit all of the circles in at one time, so you wouldn't have to keep reframing it. That being said, they can be a little unwieldy to sew because they are so big. If you're going to be using a Q-snap frame, you'll want to make sure that you cut out your fabric with at least 2 to 3 inches of overhang on each side of the frame. They do take more overhang to make them tight than a regular embroidery hoop would. Your other option is to use a regular round embroidery hoop. Whether you're sewing your circles separately or together, you would frame each circle one at a time. The first option is a wooden embroidery hoop. These are really common. They're very commonly used to frame embroideries. You can stain them, you can paint them. They're usually made out of bamboo. Keep in mind though that there are still some really cheap options for these that aren't necessarily worth your money. They're so cheap that they might break, or they'll come to you already warped, so they're not actually circular. And you always want to check your screw at the top. Sometimes those are so cheaply attached that your frame is not going to be able to tighten as much as it could. Wooden embroidery hoops are perfectly fine to sew in. They're not the best option, but they will work pretty well. A good quality one will be able to get your fabric tight enough. Your next option is a plastic embroidery hoop. These are my favorite plastic embroidery hoops. As you can see right here, they have this ridge along the inside hoop that matches up with a hump on the outside hoop. So these actually lock into each other. That means that when you put the fabric into it, you're getting this sort of U, actually more of like an S curve to the fabric. This allows you to pull your fabric really tight and keep it that way as you're sewing. So you're not going to have to keep readjusting your fabric and retightening it as you go along. This is my number one top suggestion for what to sew embroidery in. I don't generally frame embroidery in these. I prefer to keep reusing them because they do tend to run a little more expensive, but I highly suggest getting one or two of these in a couple sizes, and then you can always frame them in a wooden or a faux wood hoop that looks a little prettier. I do want to point out that there are some other kinds of plastic embroidery hoops that are not good options. When you're purchasing a plastic hoop, you want to make sure that it has that U shape on the inside hoop, not an L shape, if that makes sense. If you look a little closer here, you can see that the inside hoop just has this slight ridge that's supposed to keep it from sliding through back or forth. That does not work. These hoops are awful. The inside frame wants to pop out, and the more you tighten the outside frame around your fabric, the more it's simply going to push the inside frame outward. I would highly recommend never ever buying one of these hoops, and I definitely would recommend never ever trying to sew a piece inside of one. You'll never be able to get the fabric as tight as you need it to be. Now that we have our pattern printed out, our fabric cut out, and we've chosen a frame, the next thing we need to do is frame our fabric to prepare for tracing the pattern onto it. I'm going to quickly cover how to frame in a Q-snap frame, just for those of you who might be interested in using that option, and then we'll look at a typical embroidery hoop. For a Q-snap frame, you want to lay your fabric over the top after removing each of the plastic bars that go around the outside. You'll want to make sure that your fabric is about 2 to 3 inches bigger on every side than the Q-snap frame that you're using. From there, I like to put on the top clamp first, make sure it's on tightly, and before we do anything with that, we're going to spin the frame around and we're going to put the clamp on the opposite side. Now that you have 2 clamps on, you can spin those clamps outwards one at a time to bring the fabric up to the top of the frame. Once you've done that, you can add the side clamps. So we're going to put on the clamp on one side and then add the clamp to the other side. And then we're going to do the same thing with those side clamps. We're going to spin them outward and towards the back of the frame. And this should pretty thoroughly tighten up your fabric across the entire frame. Of course, I like to make sure that my fabric is as tight as it can possibly be. So I also go to the back of the frame where your fabric is overhanging and pull down on this fabric, especially in the corners where it doesn't have anything clamping it down. And I'll pull the fabric all the way around the frame just to make it as tight as possible, and then I'll spin those clamps one more time, pushing them all the way towards the back and making sure that that fabric is tight like a drum across the front. It's always going to have a little give in a Q-snap frame because they don't get quite as tight as a plastic embroidery hoop will, but you should be able to flick it and get a nice drum sound from the top. Now, most of you will probably be framing in an embroidery hoop, whether that is a plastic or a wooden one. It works pretty much the same way. You want to make sure that you have a proper amount of overhang on all sides of your hoop, and then you can separate the outside from the inside. You're going to lay your fabric over the inside hoop, making sure that it's centered well, and that you have a proper amount of overhang. And then you can clamp that outer hoop onto the inner one. So you're squishing that fabric in between the 2 layers of hoop. From here, we're going to start the tightening process. And let me tell you, the pet peeve of any embroiderer is seeing fabric in a hoop that has not been tightened properly. This is a really big deal for when you're sewing. If your fabric is not tightened properly, then it's going to pucker and pull and even possibly snag or fray when you're sewing your pattern, and it's just not going to look great. So it's really important that you take the time to properly tighten your fabric into your hoop before you start sewing. The first thing I like to do is tighten the screw on my hoop about halfway. That way the hoop is pretty securely on there. It's not just going to come flopping off, but it's still loose enough that I can pull my fabric through it without much resistance. I then do this pulling motion of the fabric all the way around the hoop. And right now I am doing this for the camera, so I couldn't really do it as I properly do, but I usually brace the hoop up against my body. That way I am getting the tightest pull possible. After you've done it all the way around the hoop one time, I tighten the screw again, but you can see that it's still pretty loose. You're gonna have to do the pulling around the hoop 2 or 3 times. I like to do 3 whole revolutions. Each time you finish a revolution of pulling, you're tightening the screw a little bit more. Once your fabric feels fully tight, once you've pulled it as tightly as you can, then you can tighten the screw that last little bit. That's going to just secure it in place and keep it from getting loose again. Again, you really want to commit the time into making your fabric properly tight. You should get this nice echoey sound when you tap it or when you flick it. It's worthwhile to put your time into this step of the process. It is going to make a big difference when you're sewing later on. Now, before we can start sewing, we of course need to transfer our pattern onto the fabric so that we have a guide of which stitches go where. I'm going to go through several options that I have with me here, but there are of course many other options beyond even those. My favorite is the Pilot Friction Pin. This pin is not created for embroidery specifically, but it works great because it is heat erasable. So you can draw onto fabric and then you can erase it with an iron or a blow dryer. I've even heated up a knife in a gas stove before and used that to erase little specific points. One thing I will say is that on colored fabrics, on anything that's been dyed, they can often leave ghost lines. So prior to using the Pilot Friction Pin, I really suggest that you test it out on your fabric, erase it, and make sure that it's not going to leave any of those ghost lines behind. Other options are the On-One gel pins. These are also heat erasable. I prefer the Pilot Friction pins to the On-One. The On-One just take a little longer to erase. They can be harder to erase with heat sometimes. You need higher levels and longer amounts of heat on them. The main reason that I like On-One pins is because they offer a white gel pin. So if you're wanting to embroider on dark fabrics or black fabric, this is the best option that I have found so far to draw onto darker fabrics like that. Some other options that I have are chalk pins. These are water erasable, so you need to scrub them out from fabric under water. But this white pencil is another option for drawing onto dark fabrics that could work for you. I don't love water erasable pins simply because I don't love getting my embroidery wet, but they are great options as well. A very common option for seamstresses and sewers and embroiderers of all kinds is the blue water erasable pen. This one is really common. I don't love it because when you go to rinse it out, it will streak the blue ink across your fabric. You have to rinse it pretty thoroughly in order to remove that blue dye from your fabric. And sometimes it looks like you've removed it all, and then when your piece dries, you end up with a little sort of blue puddle hiding in one section of it. And they also don't give a very fine line, but if this is all you can find, especially for something like a sampler, it definitely does work. You just want to make sure that you're rinsing it out very thoroughly when you're done. And last of all, you can always just use a regular pen or pencil. These aren't going to come out of fabric. This is permanent. But if this is all that you have, let's face it, you're working on a sampler here. This isn't a fancy design or anything, so it's not necessarily that big of a deal if you have a few pen or pencil marks left behind. One thing I will say, especially on this very first circle in this sampler, is if you're going to be using a permanent pen or pencil, you want to make sure that you only draw the dots on rather than the full lines, as the lines will be pretty visible once you are finished with the stitches. You can also use something like a water-soluble fabric, where you draw your design onto this thin fabric, put it on top of your fabric that you're embroidering on, and you embroider through both fabrics at the same time. When you're finished, you then can actually wash the fabric and it will dissolve and fall away from your design. So there's a lot of options out there. Feel free to explore and see what is the best option for you. Once you have chosen your tracing material, we are going to transfer that design onto your fabric. So for this, I typically use my Pilot friction pen and a light box. You can get light boxes pretty cheaply. I think this one was about $25 on Amazon. So that's always a great option. If you don't feel like investing in one, you can always use an iPad or a tablet screen. And you can even use just the light through a window if you want to just hold your embroidery hoop up to the window with that design. The light that comes through is usually enough to be able to see through your fabric. For this though, I am just going to turn on the light box and perfectly center my design into my hoop. You'll notice that I've turned the hoop over, so I'm tracing on what would normally be the back of the hoop. If you're using a patterned fabric, you want to keep that in mind when you put the fabric into the hoop. That way, you're actually putting the front of the fabric onto the back of the hoop. And this just allows me to put the fabric directly up against the hard surface of the light box when I'm tracing, so that I'm not pushing against that fabric and loosening the tension that we have created. After that, I'm just going to trace the design onto my fabric. Once the pattern is traced onto the fabric, you can decide whether you want to leave the design on the back side of the hoop as it currently is, or reframe the fabric so that the design is on the front. Either way is fine. I quite often sew on the back side of my hoop rather than reframing it. Sewing on the back will only cause an issue if the design comes too close to the rim of the hoop, in which case you may have some difficulty getting your needle through the fabric for some of the stitches. If you choose to switch the design to the front of the hoop, as I am doing with this one, you'll want to make sure you go through the whole process of pulling your fabric tightly, just like you did the first time, so you don't get any distortion of the pattern. And now our embroidery hoop is ready to go. We have the fabric stretched tightly there. We've got the design drawn on, so all that's left is to stitch. Let's talk about needles and thread. There are a variety of hand sewing needles that are used for embroidery, and while there is a style that is literally called an embroidery needle, I most commonly use chenille needles, tapestry needles, and sharps. All of these needles also come in a wide range of sizes, and it can be a little confusing. When in doubt, just make sure that your thread fits through the eye and that the needle glides through your fabric easily without having to puncture or stretch the fabric into too big of a hole. This style of needle is called a sharp, namely because it is sharp. It will stab you quite easily, but that is the reason I like them. I like that they go through fabric that has a tighter weave really easily. So if you're using cotton or even canvas, sharps are really helpful for those. I most typically use between a 9 to a 12 size. Those are a lot smaller though, so those are going to work well for 3 or less strands of embroidery floss. You can also jump down to the 6 through the 9 range if you're using a little bit bigger of embroidery floss. This is a tapestry needle. They run a lot larger than sharps do, and the noticeable thing about them is they have a significantly more blunt end on them. You can see that rather than tapering off smoothly, they kind of go thickly to the end and then just have a little bit of a point. These are better for loose weave fabrics. If you're trying to get them through a tighter weave of fabric, you're going to end up kind of stretching those threads and creating a really large hole. Many people do suggest using a blunt needle like this when you're doing stitches that weave through the thread on top of the fabric, just because the blunter end will keep you from catching the little threads and going through your floss when you're trying to just go under or around it. And this is a chenille needle. This is the needle I most commonly use when I'm using a thicker floss like all 6 strands or a cotton pearl. It still has that tapered, sharp end on it, and I don't really love the blunt end, but both tapestry and chenille needles will be great if you're using that thicker floss type. Last up, let's talk about embroidery floss and various kinds of thread that you could use. The most common embroidery thread is something we call floss. I most commonly use DMC, which is a really large company, especially here in America. That does go worldwide as well. There are many other brands of embroidery floss. I just really appreciate the quality that you get from DMC. Embroidery floss has 6 strands of thread that come together into one larger strand. This means that you can separate those strands as you desire. You can cut it all the way down to just 1 strand of thread, or you can use all 6. You can double up that strand and use 12 if you're going for something really thick. It gives you a lot of options for thread sizes and textures. Another option is a cotton pearl thread. I'm suggesting these because these are the 2 threads that I have used when doing this sampler, is just regular embroidery floss and the cotton pearl. Cotton pearl thread is much thicker. It's almost to like a yarn stage. So there are some stitches that work really well in this cotton pearl thread because they require sort of a thicker thread in order for them to look proper. And as we go through the stitches of the sampler, I will always point out when I've used the cotton pearl and when that's the best option. That being said, every stitch that you're doing on the sampler could be done with a thicker thread like the cotton pearl. You might simply want to do a larger design, something maybe 6 inches or bigger if you're going to be using a thicker thread like that. You could also do every single stitch here with regular embroidery floss. There are some stitches that may not just look quite the same when you're using those thinner threads. Of course, there are many other styles and types and materials of embroidery floss that you could use. Such as this yarn here. This is a pretty thin yarn and it could be sewn with just as easily. However, for the purposes of this sampler, I have only used DMC cotton pearl and embroidery floss. Like I mentioned, embroidery floss is made up of 6 different strands of thread, and while you can sew with all 6, it's quite common and probably even more common to separate those threads into smaller sections before we start to embroider. I get asked how to separate threads a lot. It is something that frustrates a lot of beginner stitchers, so we're going to walk through that really fast. If you just need to separate 1 strand of thread, it's a super easy process. You're just going to separate at the very end that 1 strand, isolate it from the others, and then while holding back the rest of your threads, pull that 1 thread straight up and out of the mix. You'll see that the rest of the threads kind of bunch up in your hand behind. It looks like it's getting knotted and making a mess. It actually isn't. Just keep pulling. That 1 strand will come all the way out, and then the rest of those strands will release, and you shouldn't have any knots in the single strand or in the remaining strands. Now, some people, when they want to sew with more than 1 strand of thread, will separate their thread into the single strands and then put them back together into the number of strands that they want. I don't prefer doing that, however. I would rather go ahead and separate them into the exact number of strands that I want. So you can see with this short piece of thread that I'm using, I'm able to just separate the threads at the top. Here I'm separating it into 2 strands and 3 strands, and then just gently pull and the thread will unwind and separate without really causing any knots or problems. But that's really only because it's such a short piece of thread, and we are normally using much longer pieces of thread. So here is my trick for how to separate a longer piece of embroidery floss into the number of strands that you want. The first thing I'm going to do is separate the very end of the thread into the number of strands I want. So in this case, separating it into 2 sections of 3 strands each. Like so. And then I'll pull those 2 strands apart so that I have anywhere from like 3 to 6 inches of separation. It shouldn't start getting tangly just from that amount, but that gives me a bit to work with. Then one section I'm going to tuck into the palm of my hand, holding with my 3 fingers just like this, and the other section goes between my thumb and forefinger on the same hand. So you can see I'm creating a Y shape here. The pointer of my other hand is going to go right into the separation of that Y, and you can see I'm using my other fingers to put a little bit of tension on the tail of the Y, or the stand of the Y, as I pull down with my finger. Now that just keeps a long strand of thread from tangling up as you pull through. You can see that as it spins, it's going to want to spin tighter and tighter up into itself. But if we just keep a little bit of tension there, and then whenever it gets too tight, you can see I release and let those tangles kind of spin out on their own. And then I pull again, and then release and pull and release and pull, so that I'm pulling down away from those tangles and then releasing and letting them spin out on their own. And in that way, as you're pulling down gently in the V of that Y, you can get all the way to the end of your thread without any tangles, without any knots. And now we have 2 separate strands of embroidery floss, each containing 3 threads. After a couple tries, after practicing it just a little bit, this will be like second nature to you, so much so that I had to sit down and actually study how I was doing it before making this video, because I couldn't remember on my own. It's just such second nature to me now to separate my threads this way, and I never have any problems with it. So I actually had to sit down and think about how I was doing this. Our very last step is going to be threading our needle and knotting the end of it. This is literally the last thing you do before actually creating a stitch. So to thread your needle, I prefer to wet the ends of my threads so that they are smooth and kind of stuck together. So some people don't like this, but I still just lick the ends of my thread. It's the way we've been doing it for generations. By wetting them down, you can get them into sort of a flat little board that will easily fit through that flat oval that is the eye of the needle. And threading a needle is really just a repetitive skill. It's one of those things that may seem hard the first couple times you're doing it, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes. I've been doing it so long now that I can thread a needle while a plane is landing. It is just all about repetition and practice. And now we just have to knot our thread on the end. This is again something that there are many different tricks and tools of the trade in order to get done. I'm going to show you the way that my mother taught me to knot the thread way back in the day, and I've been doing this ever since. I just find it the easiest. I start by going to the end of my thread. I grasp it between my thumb and my forefinger and then wrap it around once. Then all you have to do is rub your fingers together, and I use my other finger to kind of slide that knot down to the end. And there you go. You've got a knot on your end of your thread. It is really easy. It's another one of those repetition skills. You only got to do this one, 3 or 4 times, and it will become like second nature to you. Alright, that is everything you need to know before starting this embroidery sampler, and quite frankly, pretty much any embroidery piece. I hope that this video has given you a really solid foundation of information to get you started on your embroidery journey, and I'm really looking forward to putting out more tutorials and helping you guys create this really awesome chain stitch sampler that's going to be using 90 variations of chain stitch. There's some really awesome stitches in there, lots of nice basic stitches for beginners, and lots of more complicated stitches that are really just a joy to complete, make you feel very successful. So I hope you will continue to follow along, and if you were just here to learn about embroidery in general, I hope that you enjoy taking up this new hobby. It's a great one. We have an awesome community, and I welcome you to it. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.